My name is Will Tuttle. I'm the author of The World Peace Diet.
Now, The World Peace Diet is a really beautiful, wonderful book, and it's been an inspiration to many people. But what I'm wondering is if you could talk to us a little bit about what was your journey to your own personal spiritual transformation that really led to the writing of this book?
Yeah, the journey that led me to writing The World Peace Diet began when I was a kid in Concord, Massachusetts. And I think in many ways I was very lucky to be born there because that is the seat not only of the American Revolution, and my father every April 19th would get his gun off the wall and put on his Minuteman outfit and celebrate the revolution and the idea that if we have a situation that's intolerable, we should make a change. But also the Transcendentalists, Thoreau and Emerson, were there, and I think perhaps on some level I picked up on the ideas of connecting authentically with the spiritual dimension of life and respecting nature and animals and the value of exploring other spiritual traditions from Asia and so forth. But as far as food goes, we ate the typical meals, lots of meat, dairy products, and eggs. This was back in the 1950s. I remember when I was about 7 years old, I said to my mother, "So, Mom, the kind of food we're eating, is this what everybody eats?" And my mother said, "Yeah, this is what everybody eats. This is the normal food that everybody eats." And then she came back a few minutes later, and she said, "Well, there are vegetarians." And she said it in this way that I knew these vegetarians must live on another planet. And she said, "I've never met one." You'll probably never meet one either. You know, they're sort of hypothetical people. Where do they get their protein? And we didn't know. And so my mother was totally right. That's how my life went on. I never heard the word again. I went away to the summer camp in Vermont a couple of summers when I was in my teen years. And as part of that, we killed our own chickens. We killed our own cows, the dairy cows that weren't giving enough milk. And so I participated in those things, and I was somewhat disturbed by it, but I didn't really deeply question it. And looking back, I can see that at the time I was 13 years old, I had already gone through 13 years of the most intense indoctrination a human being can go through in terms of knowing beyond a shadow of a doubt that God put animals on this earth for us to eat, certain animals, that they taste good, they don't have a soul, and if you don't eat them, you'll definitely die within 24 hours of a protein deficiency. So this was it. I just knew that we were doing the right thing by killing these animals and then eating them. And I went away to college, and I still never met a vegetarian. I heard there were some around, but I remember eventually after college, it was right after the Vietnam War era, I was kind of during that era, and I was questioning things quite a bit, and I decided, along with my brother, to take a spiritual pilgrimage. And so we left home, we left Concord, we walked down the driveway, and we were heading to California. We wanted to attain cosmic consciousness, something. We didn't want to just go into the world of business. We wanted to first try to understand more deeply our own inner truth. And so we headed west for a while and got as far as Buffalo. And it was October, it was already freezing, and we decided to head south. So we actually walked all the way down through upstate New York, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Kentucky, into Tennessee over a few months. And we didn't have any money. We were just meditating and doing an inquiry. And I remember starting to really question whether it's right to kill and eat animals. I remember I was given the opportunity, we both were, to stay in a cabin by a stream that had fishing equipment, and we didn't have any food, so I remember going out and catching a couple of fish. But it just didn't seem right. I remember catching the fish, and they didn't die easily. I had to slam them on the floor violently, and it just seemed like, here I am meditating for peace, for harmony, for wisdom, for kindness, compassion, and then here I am killing and slamming these poor fish, But I just thought I needed to get enough protein, So then, when a few weeks later, really, I mean, it was maybe by the end of the year, toward the end of the year, we arrived at the farm in Tennessee, and this was the largest hippie commune in the world, about 900 people, mostly from California, and they were all vegetarians, every one of them. I mean, there was a totally vegetarian community, and in fact, we would probably call them vegans. in the sense that they didn't eat dairy products either, or eggs. And no one was dying of a protein deficiency. So for me, the spiritual journey that I had been on of meditation and inquiry and reading spiritual books, not only the Bible and Western mystics, but I was also very interested in Buddhism and Taoism and Hinduism and so forth. And so I began to see that the way these people were living was in harmony with the universal principles. And there's an ancient Buddhist, actually it's a universal teaching called ahimsa, which means nonviolence. And the basic teaching is if we harm others for our own benefit, we not only cause misery to them, we actually cause even more misery to ourselves than we do to them. We don't realize it typically, but we put ourselves into a prison, and we create a world of competition and fear and violence when we harm others for our own benefit. And so I realized that I had been born into a society that had basically forced me from the time I was a little infant to participate in the daily meal rituals of eating animal foods, which had in many ways shut down or reduced my connection to the inner wisdom and compassion and intelligence, which I think are really, for all of us, are our true nature. And in order really so that I could unquestioningly participate in business and economics and education and get ahead and compete and in a sense be a cog in a much larger machine, which I was more and more thinking and feeling that this large machine is devastating the planet, and it's causing a lot of war, a lot of disease, a lot of suffering to animals and other people. So that was basically it. I never ate meat again in my life from the time that the fellow I was talking to there said that eating animal foods was causing hunger because people could be eating the grain that is fed to animals, but they're starving, and it also causes so much suffering to the animals themselves. So I saw we had this whole curtain up that we don't look behind, kind of like in The Wizard of Oz, where you just don't look behind the curtain. And I think the greatest thing we can do, really, to be aware in our society today, is to look behind the curtain of our routine mistreatment of animals for food and other products. And so that's really got me going on the journey to writing the World Peace Diet. I ended up eventually getting to California and discovering more deeply the suffering to dairy cows and hens. So I became a vegan essentially in 1980, roughly. And then a few years later, in 1984, I shaved my head and became a Zen monk in Korea. And I found myself for the second time in my life in a community where people, it was a vegan community where people didn't eat meat or dairy. There was no wool, silk, or leather. I mean, it was a totally, it was a total experience of minimizing violence to animals. And we were meditating from 3 o'clock in the morning till 9 o'clock at night, all day in silence for months. And so I realized again now that veganism is not this newfangled hippie idea sort of from California, that it's really an ancient wisdom teaching that's at the core of all world religions. So when I came back to this country, I felt that I had roots of this plant-based living that went deep into my heart. It wasn't just sort of a shallow thing like a choice that I was making. I really felt that this is really my true nature, that animals are not food. They are beings that are celebrating their lives. We don't look at other human beings and think, well, you would taste good. That would be considered completely ridiculous. Or even to look at dogs that way. But certain animals, we're trained to look with an eye of violence and of reduction. We reduce them, we sell them by the pound. They're just a piece of meat. And this is a hideous reduction that allows us to cause horrible violence towards these animals, and then eat it and feed it to our children. So that's the journey. The journey really was, for me to write the World Peace Diet, was then to try to get to the core understanding. So the World Peace Diet really, I think in many ways, is the first book, at least in English, or maybe in any language, that gives the big picture of our of the ramifications of our routine mistreatment of animals for food primarily and for other products. And talks not only about that it's not so good for our health and for the environment and for the animals, but also goes into the anthropology of this, the sociology, the psychology, the spiritual dimension, the history of it. And I think when people, all of us, I think when we understand this bigger picture, then we have a much deeper awareness of how we can actually transform our society in a positive way. So it's been enormously gratifying to me that the World Peace Diet has now been translated into about 16 languages, and it was a #1 Amazon bestseller back in 2010, and it's really been getting out. The message has been getting out. I think that more and more people are receptive to this message.